Today, joining me at the Merrick Art Gallery in New Brighton is Ryan O'Shea, representing the Grove Cemetery.
Excited to be talking about that.
Wow, it sounds like a fire in my headphones. Yeah, not so bad. It just sounds like a conversation. That's fine. I have enough trouble just listening to myself.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, sounds good. Welcome to the Little Beaver Historical Society podcast. I'm going to ask some questions, but you know how this is going to work,
Yeah, but I ask about opinions. You're asking me about facts, and that's a whole new level of...
What do they call them? Alternative facts?
Alternative facts, yes.
Ryan, you want to tell us a little about yourself and how you got involved with Grove Cemetery?
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. This is one that I definitely enjoy that dives into local history, and I think this is a very important topic to keep these stories alive. So thank you for doing that. I am a board member at Grove Cemetery in New Brighton, Pennsylvania. I've lived in New Brighton my entire life, and this is a cemetery that I spent a lot of time in. I used to go there, in high school to just take walks, look at nature, experience a lot of the history that you're literally surrounded by there. And I've always been interested in history, studied it at the University of Pittsburgh. And when I graduated, I wanted to get involved in preserving these stories and the history of our area, particularly here in Beaver County in western Pennsylvania.
Well, you have an interesting history in New Brighton. You actually grew up right across the street from Merrick Art Gallery in an Underground Railroad house, right?
I did, yes. Underground Railroad and the Merricks tie through this entire story, whether it's me growing up 100 yards from where we're sitting right now, all the way through the Merricks owning the land became Grove Cemetery. So all of these things are very intertwined in a very interesting way. And I'm sure everyone knows that the Underground Railroad was extremely important in New Brighton history, in Darlington area history, in Beaver County history. That's one of the most well-known things about this area. And what I think is really fascinating is that many of these people who had these safe houses in New Brighton, who were the staunch abolitionists, many of them are buried in Grove Cemetery, and their stories are preserved there.
Some of the most important people in New Brighton history were mill owners and different owners, part of, and most of the things are named for them, and that's the Townsend family. And there are many Townsends buried in the Grove Cemetery, right?
There are. Townsends are just one of many notable local families that are buried there. You also have, as I mentioned, the Merricks. There's the Reeves there. There's multiple families, mainly in one section up on the hill, which overlooks a great view of the rest of the cemetery. You can see all the way up to Oak Hill and the New Brighton football field we have there. There's great views from that cemetery, and many of the prominent families of Beaver County and New Brighton history are in one small location up there.
Recently, I noticed you guys had a rededication of a Civil War soldier at Grove Cemetery.
Yeah, so there are many veterans of various wars buried at Grove Cemetery. We do have a Civil War monument there. Just a little bit about that monument. It's 21 feet high. It weighs a few tons. There was a 7-foot high statue of a Civil War soldier on top of this monument that was dedicated in the 1860s. It was made of zinc, and it became unstable after about 100 years, so that had to be taken down, but was recently replaced with a smaller Civil War statue. But yeah, there is James Howard Bruin, who is a very noteworthy Civil War veteran. He was an escaped slave. He escaped slavery, came to Beaver County, and made his home in New Brighton, and he served in the Civil War. And after his service in the Civil War, he brought his tattered battle flag, which was riddled with bullet holes, back to New Brighton. And for every parade from then until his death, he carried this tattered battle flag.
Yes, we actually have a picture of Sergeant Bruin, and very large man. He was a very large man. And somebody told me he operated a barber shop in New Brighton. I think that's what he did after the Civil War. I think he was a barber.
Yeah, I was a barber here in New Brighton, and an interesting fact about him is he was married 5 different times, and one of those marriages took place at the Beaver County Courthouse as part of the centennial celebration of Beaver County.
But these cemeteries, what happens, and I'm thankful that somebody like Ryan and the board has gotten involved. What happens is people that take care of the cemetery, the board gets old, people die, nobody comes back on the board, the church or whoever is involved with the cemetery disappears. And what happens is the stones fall over, the inscriptions disappear, and we forget the history of these people.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second to thank all of the people that are making the upkeep of Grove Cemetery possible. You mentioned the board that we have. We have an amazing board. Brian Fabianic is the president of the board. He's been doing amazing work, starting as a volunteer, just getting his hands dirty. Let's see how I can help out the cemetery, getting involved with the board. He's the one that brought me on. So many other people doing great work there, and the town support as well. We have the Masons Lodge of New Brighton comes up quite often to help us do work up with it, whether it's cutting grass or setting up toppled tombstones. Rome Monument has done some work with us. Just the support of the town and the community. We can't do it ourselves, and we thank all these people that are making it possible. And the walking tour pamphlet was made possible as well by Beaver County Tourism. They've put some funds together for that, as well as another local community organization called Brighten Up, which I also serve on the board of, made that walking tour pamphlet possible. And what I would love to see, you mentioned the purpose of the walking tour pamphlet and all of the other history and local cemeteries around. I would love to see other local cemeteries in historical areas copy what we've done and make their own walking tour pamphlet. And if anyone needs help with that, please reach out to me, because I'm happy, having gone through the experience of doing it for Grove Cemetery, to offer advice and support to help you get yours done.
So what do you look at the future of Grove Cemetery?
I think it has a storied past, and it's going to have a storied future, right? The sky's the limit for what we're capable of doing. There are talks to have new developments there. We know you can't really expand the cemetery at this point beyond, the geographical confines of it, but there are still plots available to be purchased. There's going to be, more burials going on into the future. We're looking to redo the roads there. That's one of the main things that needs to be done. So we're actively seeking funding for those types of initiatives. So if anyone wants to get involved, help out with the cemetery, just come experience the history of it, it's open for you to do that.
In Beaver County, these Southern sympathizers then took brush, piled it in front of the mine, set the brush on fire, the smoke went back into the mine. There were like 4 or 5 slaves back there that were killed.
So today, Chuck comes to speak to us about the Underground Railroad in Beaver County. The Townsend family was the premier family that dealt with the Underground Railroad early in Beaver County history. Is that right, Chuck?
That's correct, Dave.
Now, your family came to New Brighton in what era?
In the early 1800s, 1830s, somewhere around that time.
We stole away in the black of the moon. We don't take nothing, just a hatchet and some bread in a sack. We walked till I about give out. When my legs couldn't go no more, we laid by till starlight. We knew the North Star, how it would lead us out of slave country.
Fix me for my journey home. Fix me, Jesus. Fix me.
You are listening to a production of the Social Voice Podcast Network.
Welcome to this episode of the Little Beaver Historical Society podcast. I'm your host, Dave Holowico.
The Townsend family, the thing that's important with them, I guess, in relation to the Underground Railroad, was that they were Quakers, and because they were Quakers, they were very much opposed to the oppression of people of any kind, and they were very peaceful people, and they felt that it was a moral an immorality what was happening, particularly in the southern states, but also there was that presence in the north as well.
Now, I know many of your relatives settled in New Brighton, and many of their houses still exist in New Brighton. These houses were used on the Underground Railroad to actually transport slaves and hide them, right, during their escapes?
Yeah, the main focus of New Brighton becoming important in the abolitionist movement was its location, particularly being on the Beaver River, which was very helpful. The flow of slaves generally to this area would be freedom seekers coming up from the south, maybe coming up to around Georgetown or that area, being protected by certain families in the what's called the south side of Beaver now. And then they were transported quite often to Bridgewater. And there are several houses that you're maybe familiar with in Bridgewater, that one of which is still standing, that were very prominent in hiding and protecting the slaves. From there, then at night, quite often, the Quakers would come down from New Brighton, pick up the 8 or 10, however many slaves there were, and take them to the New Brighton area. And the different towns and properties. Some of them were equipped to take care of that. For example, the David Townsend's flour mill had some areas in it where they could hide slaves. Robert Townsend, which is now the Spratt Funeral Home, was a very large house located on the river, and there were in the basement places where the slaves could be hidden. Probably the most prominent of those was somebody you don't often hear about was Benjamin Townsend. Unfortunately, his house no longer exists. It's where the New Brighton Middle School playing fields are now located. But he had a place where he stored vegetables and that sort of thing, and a trap door led from the house down into this area where they hid the slaves. Other Townsend houses, the William Penn Townsend House, was also used for this purpose in New Brighton.
I know you mentioned the David Townsend flour mill, and it was on an island in the middle of the Beaver River, right?
That's correct.
So they would row the slaves to the island, spend the night, and when darkness came, they would row them across to the other houses in New Brighton.
That would be one of the approaches. If they were brought up by boat, that was certainly the way, and that was common. Although sometimes they were transported in wagons or whatever as well to the different houses.
Now, a lot of people, when they think of the Underground Railroad, they think of the Civil War, but this predates the Civil War by many years, right?
Yeah, I would imagine that in Beaver County particularly, and maybe throughout the nation, I don't know, that the abolitionist movement probably started being important as a movement in the 1830s. And particularly by the time you get to the 1840s and into the 50s, it is a prominent movement. First of all, in the early stages of it, it was quashed by the powers that be to suppress it. But as more and more people became aware of the atrocities and what the degradation that it was causing to people, there was more of an uprising against it. In the early stages, abolitionists and those who tried to protect the slaves were sometimes beaten. For example, some people who were publishing pamphlets had their presses smashed. They were beaten up in the streets, and it's a lot of anger directed at them by the powers that be that were trying to suppress a movement that would have primarily, I guess you would say, affect the economic interests of those involved.
Now, New Brighton became one of the premier places in Western Pennsylvania for national abolitionists to visit. Some of those national abolitionists, Frederick Douglass had visited New Brighton, right?
I understand that he spoke several times in New Brighton. I have documentation in a book written by William Lloyd Garrison of one of those trips. And this was a trip that William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and others came to New Brighton under the invitation of my great-grandfather, Milo Townsend, and his wife, Elizabeth. And they came particularly to speak to the New Brighton abolitionists. Interestingly enough, we always think that the Quakers were unified in their approach to the slavery movement, but that was not so. For example, there were a large group of Hicksite Quakers living in New Brighton that were not abolitionists and were not opposed. And so when Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison came, that meeting house of the Quakers in New Brighton was not available because of the Hicksite control of it. So sometimes I understand in New Brighton that the First Presbyterian Church was used for some of these speeches. But in this particular occasion, which took place in 1847, I believe, when these two people came, they had to go to a store, mercantile establishment in New Brighton on the second floor. And at that point, they gave the speech there. According to Garrison's memoirs on this, before the event took place, there were some rowdyism, as he called it, in the streets of people opposed to what was going on in there, but that was suppressed. And so many people came. He said that there were like up to 200 that were meeting on this second floor of this store. And there were also other people in the street that couldn't get in. It was a very hot night. And the Garrison said that he almost melted, he said, from the heat that was there.
This is Brian Hager.
This is Dennis Garrett, and you are listening to the Little Beaver Historical Society podcast.
The North Country National Scenic Trail, generally known as the North Country Trail or simply the NCT, is a footpath stretching approximately 4,600 miles from Crown Point in eastern New York to Lake Sacagawea State Park in central North Dakota.
Remember, hike your own hike, and see you on the trails.
You are listening to a production of the Social Voice Podcast Network.
The North Country Trail is unique among National Scenic Trails. Not only is it the longest trail in the National Scenic Trail system, but it's the most diverse in terms of its scenery, topography, and the landscapes. North Country Trail volunteers simply are the lifeblood of this trail. They're the only way this trail could ever be built.
The ground is smooth and hikers don't have to worry about tripping over any branches or big rocks.
Another really satisfying part about it is just being able to really see the progress that we've made. Like, it started off as sort of a grassy, root-filled pathway, and now it's a trail.
Follow the blue blazes to discover a connection with nature, the past, and each other. The North Country Trail will lead you to enchanting, wild places through trail towns and can help discover yourself.
The North Country Trail offers opportunities for personal connection with nature, with the outdoors, the kind of thing that transforms an area or a trail into a meaningful place, a place that evokes deep desires to conserve it, to protect it, and to pass it on to future generations.
They say they just hope to see people getting out and using it.
Welcome to this episode of the Little Beaver Historical Society podcast. I'm the guest host today, Kevin Farkas of the Social Voice Project, sitting in for Dave Halawico, who normally sits in this seat and interviews fascinating guests from the area on historical topics of interest to the Little Beaver Historical Society area. Darlington, PA, for example, where we're sitting right now in the historic Greersburg Academy. Just outside the academy here is a marker that lets us know that the North Country Trail comes right past this building, right through Darlington. So this podcast episode is going to be about the North Country Trail, and we have with us today Brian Hager and Dennis Garrett, who are members of the NCT North Country Trail Wampum chapter, the local organization that takes care of this trail, maintains it, makes sure it's in good order for whether it's an afternoon hiker or a serious through hiker, as they say, somebody doing the trail from end to end, the over 4,000 miles of this trail. So, hey, welcome, guys. Thanks for being here, and let's talk about the trail.
So basically, in 1968, the National Trail System Act passed by Congress started the National Trail Systems, which basically introduced the first two trails, which were the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, basically east and west, and they went up and down the coastline. As time went on, during that period of time, they basically looked and see, hey, we have these two great trails. Can we make more of them? You know what I mean? Because the idea goes back to Roosevelt and Muir, 1903, the Great Camp, you know, they were trying to save the wilderness as much as possible. So one of the trails that they decided that would work would be the North Country Trail. So shortly after that, in 1971, they put together a task force to basically find out the feasibility of a trail that would, basically cross the top of the United States. During that period of time, they tried to think of things like, they'll make sure we pass all the Great Lakes, and basically connect the dots of all the public lands that existed during that time between the state parks as well as the federal parks. In 1980, the North Country National Scenic Trail, as it is called entirely, was authorized by Congress. Shortly after that, they realized that, North Country Trail is mostly made up of volunteers, and fundraising is done by them. So in 1981, within a year after it was formed, the North Country Trail Association was formed. And they're basically the nonprofit backbone to the national park system. And after that, then it started forming. A lot of this was done up in Michigan, Wisconsin, the areas before it started trickling down. Now, how it led to, becoming in Beaver County and Darlington, Mr. Garrett here got a chance to talk to Richard Lutz, who was the very first president. And that was in 1989, they put together the Wampum chapter. And
yeah, it was in 1997, 98 that the Wampum chapter was formed. So it took all those years to get over into Pennsylvania and start organizing volunteer chapters in the state of Pennsylvania. And there's a gentleman who works for the National Park Service still today. His name's Bill Menke. His position was over here in western Pennsylvania, and he started to get volunteer chapters formed in western PA. And there was a young man who was actually still in high school. His name was Richard Lutz. Was interested in hearing about the North Country Trail and went to a meeting, and Bill Menke was there. And Richard Lutz and another gentleman, Bob Taft, was very influential in these forming the first chapter here in southwestern Pennsylvania, close to the Ohio border. So they were assigned the two counties, Lawrence and Beaver counties, for responsibility of building the trail. They decided that Wampum was kind of midway between Lawrence and the Ohio line, so that became the headquarters and the name of the chapter, the Wampum chapter. And Richard became the first president of the chapter and was very influential in getting the first segments of the trail off the road in our two counties.
Well, I certainly want to talk more about the trail here in Beaver County. I mean, it could have gone further north or maybe even further south. You guys would know why it actually came through here in particular. But I want to point out that the work that you guys do to maintain the trails is just phenomenal. And, you're all volunteers, right? And you come out and you just have a love of the outdoors, but you put a lot of work into clearing the brush and cutting the water bars and all that sort of stuff so that, weekenders or the thru hikers could have a nice experience. So my hat's off to you guys who do that kind of work. I've been on a lot of long distance trails around the country, and from the most wilderness, remote mountaintops to, the parts of the trail near roadheads, your presence is felt. You can just see the work that you've done to make these trails a great experience. We're not talking about like beating through the bush. We're talking about really well-maintained, cleared brush, graded, sloping switchbacks that are safe, not crazy scrambles up the hillsides and stuff. So I just want to, before we go more into this, I just want to point out the great work that you guys do. And hopefully you will talk about how people can get involved and the work that you guys actually do on the trails here in Wampum. But could you tell me how the trail got into Darlington itself, where we're sitting right here at Greersburg Academy of the Little Beaver Historical Society? Right outside is the trail. How did it get right here?
Well, when the chapter was originally formed, there was an overall plan for the trail, a general overall plan. And that basically was use all the public lands you can. And so in our county, there are 4 large sections of public lands: McConnell's Mill State Park, Game Lands 148, and Game Lands 285. So I guess that's only 3. So it was easy to get permission to put the trail in those public lands. So now you had to connect those public lands, connect the dots, and Route 168 was the choice coming out of McConnell's Mills. We quickly got permission on private property on Cemex and Gateway mines, which brought us almost to Beaver County in the woods. So then we had to follow a road to get us over to Game Lands 285 in South Beaver Township. And so that became the best way to do that. At that time, the decision was made to follow Route 168, which brought the trail on the road through New Galley and through Darlington, out to South Beaver, Game Lands 285. So that's how the trail came through Darlington.
So these things are often just cobbled together, whichever way they can be put together, using preferably the wilderness routes, right, through the game lands or state parks, state forests, what have you. But if they have to go on roadways, they have to go on roadways, so they snake around. And I remember a few years back that the trail was very different. The trail came into Darlington here in a different way than it does currently. It follows the creek now up through Cannleton, but it used to take a roadway into town. And so these things are always evolving, right? That's what I'm trying to understand. Is like
another thing to talk about too is something that we also do. It's not just the trail, but it's also the community. You were talking about how the community comes together. Well, not only is Darlington the town that it goes through, but it's actually a trail town, a part of the North Country Trail. And Wampum, namesake for our chapter, was the very first in 2013. In 2014, Darlington became a trail town. And one of the things we're going to be doing, which later on we'll talk about the events and things like that, is the fact that it's not just about the trail itself. It's about the town, the businesses, the people, and stuff like that. It's, in order for the trail to survive and be accessible to the hikers, we need stores like Stop and Shop, and let them know, hey, these are things that hikers need. And they have a wide variety. I was really impressed by the things that they had, but getting that business to kind of show out, or maybe put a sticker or something, let you know hikers welcome. Or other stores. We know a butcher and a baker here, great place. I know a lot of people have had this food. We just now got him in the fold of things, and he's going to start doing little things. And now that town is seeing a revenue from maybe these few hikers that come through, and the future of more hikers coming through. But it also shows to other people, hey, they care not only for the town, but here's a national trail that comes through here, and that helps them. And we do little adverts for the business, and they're happy for it and stuff. But it's important that they have a place to come to, because out in the woods, say they can't get a hold of somebody, and Trail Magic isn't enough. They need something. They need to know when they come off that trail that, here's the police department, here's the fire department. This is where I can get backup batteries, or the post office. The AT is a great blueprint for all those things. And people might not think, wow, that's this big trail. It all starts off the same. It's 5 foot wide, it's this big, and hikers are coming through. And our job is to let the business owners know what they need to supply the hikers, and that they're here, and that we care about their businesses in this community.
All right, welcome to this very special episode. I'm the guest host today, Kevin Farkas of the Social Voice Project. What you hear in the background is a whole heck of a lot of festivities that we have going on here at the 2019 Darlington Days. And this is a celebration that's been going on for more than 20 years? Is this the 20th year?
This is the 20th year, yes.
20th year, and that is Sally Mahon, who is the person who put this together. Joining us also is Jim Shaner, who is the Grand Marshal of the parade. How was the parade this morning?
Oh, super great, super great. That was the best because I've owned that carriage for 30 years, and that's the first time I rode in it.
Is that right? And that carriage is 1880.
That's 1880. It was made in Chicago at C.P. Kimball and Company, and I'm the third owner on it.
Well, congratulations on being the Grand Marshal for the parade today.
Thank you.
This is a big celebration, and I wanted to have you two on today to talk about what it took to put this together, because I think you guys deserve the credit. If you could see Sally's face.
Oh, yeah.
Sally, when did the planning begin for Darlington Days this year?
Last year on this very day, I start planning for the following year. I do, whether it's brainstorming or just simply looking around and seeing what can be changed. Somebody coming up saying they want to be involved next year, then that's just how I do it. I start right away. We usually start in November with committee meetings, and then it just moves on from there. So it's a year-round planning process.
Is that why you got involved with Darlington Days?
I constantly pay it forward. That's what my life is. I pay it forward to whether it's for benefits or whatnot. I ran into Greg and Mary Lou. They explained, oh, we could use some young blood. Well, that's all that it took. And once I came on board, met Ferg, and started learning from Alan Ferguson, my heart was here. I just have to keep it going. And now more so because he's gone and the Gishbachers are officially retired. So.
And these are the pioneers of Darlington Days.
Correct.
And this is, you mentioned the 20th year?
Yes, 20th year.
How far does it go back with you?
I've been on board about 6 years. My first year was kind of just standing back, looking around, oh, what is all this? And then I jumped in with 2 feet with Ferg, and he's taught me all that I knew, but boy, whenever he was gone, I didn't know it all.
That's important, right? So by and large, these small town historical societies and museums, the volunteers who come out and just really make it happen are generally an older crowd, right? So you mentioned you were tapped to be, the young person to come on board and to keep this moving forward. So you're saying that you learned how to do this from those, Alan Ferguson came before you, and Jim has that knowledge. I look around the festivities here and I see a lot of children who are learning about Darlington Days, and maybe one day they will be on your committee helping to celebrate. What are your thoughts on all the children that you see here?
I love it. My moments that I get to sit and just people watch, that's what I love, because I just love seeing families together, the smiles on the kids' faces. They have a blast, whether they're seeing, or getting to do a walking stick or they're dancing to music. To them, they're out with their family, and that's why I do it. That's what it's all about. Putting that glow in their heart that they'll remember little things, and we'll be a part of their memory.
It's more than just history. It's
Correct.
More than just the buildings. It's more than really just these activities. What we're talking about here today is community. Mm-hmm. Coming together. We're all in this together, right?
You're
we're
right.
all part of this community. And today's our day to celebrate, our weekend to celebrate.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you're aware, down at the center of town just last night, we dedicated the sign that was pretty much what we're talking about, a community involvement. The guys that do the Sunday poker run, the Cannonball Run, they busted their butts for 2 years fundraising to put that sign down there in memory of Alan Ferguson, because that's what he wanted to do, replace our Welcome to Darlington signs. And he never got to fulfill that. So the boys did. But it wasn't just the boys when you break it down. It was a little bit of everybody. Businesses, people giving up an hour of their time, or dropping off Gatorade, or hey, are you guys, need something for lunch? That's what all brought that together at that corner. So
I noticed a few days back that you were out here sweeping the streets. And you were asking people to come help sweep the streets, and I assume you got some help.
I did get some, yes, lovely friends that showed up to help. Yeah, we try to get it ready for everybody. I mean, somebody's got to do it, so we put the manpower behind it and we get it done to make it beautiful.
I tell people, Darlington has such a excitement about it, and you draw people from all over, and the population's only, this is what I tell people, it's only 200 or so, right? It's like, what's the
That's
draw
if you're
here?
counting the borough and the township. No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe a few squirrels.
And a couple years ago, I had a group that was antique tool collector club, and they said it was the best museum that they ever was into, because you could touch things. It's not like you have roped it off and not be able to even go look at it.
Experience it, right.
And I was in actually their newsletter, and they even raved at it in the newsletter, and they still do.
You're famous, Jeff. Just admit it. You're a famous
We're
guy.
so lucky. We are blessed. Our town is little, but our roots are big, because it's just a town that once you've been here, you're so comfortable.
There's such a connection here to, the local community, Beaver Falls, Darlington, New Brighton. But I'm looking at this plaque right here at Gettysburg Academy, and there are connections here to national level figures, right?
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about, William McGuffey, See Spot Run. Those McGuffey readers had spent time here in Darlington, as well as John Brown. of John Brown Armory fame.
Yep.
Fierce abolition. And speaking of abolition, this town is on the Underground Railroad.
Correct.
Which is really, really significant. And the abolitionist movement, which really got going here in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, big presence right here in this this town of Darlington.
Mm-hmm. And it ended up that Darlington and New Brighton was the major hubs for the Underground Railroad. And there are houses still in town here that have tunnels.
Wouldn't it be fabulous to just get a video of those tunnels? Like, obviously we can't ever experience those tunnels because it's probably not safe, but my gosh, a video of those tunnels, that would be amazing to watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your special guest host, Tony Lavorna, and you're listening to the Little Beaver Historical Society podcast. As I make my way through the Darlington Days Festival on its 20th anniversary, I come through, I can hear the music playing, and the parade is just finished. Today, joining me will be an author of a local book on the history and lore of this region. The next voice you're going to hear is that of Mr. Michael Kishbutcher. Michael has recently written Legends and Lore of Little Beaver Creek, produced by the Arcadia Book Company.
Yeah, so in Ira's writings, I was surprised to find that he believed he had unearthed on a few hills in Cannleton and Negley area ancient mounds and ring forts. He found lots of carvings of animals and native scenes, and he even talked about grave robbing some of the burial mounds. There's a burial mound in Negley that probably was the one Ira was talking about. There's one here in Darlington that my grandfather told me about. It's just over by the lake.
You are listening to a production of the Social Voice Podcast Network.
Michael, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to meet a fellow author and someone who's very interested in local folklore.
I am very much interested in local folklore, but I don't know if I call myself an author quite yet. This is my first book, so I need to catch up to you.
That's okay. There's a lot of room for you. There's a lot of room for you in our field. And I like the fact that you come to it with a healthy, skeptical view on points, and that you're interested in also the history behind some of these legends.
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably a good mesh of history and folklore, because as I've found, they tend to both intertwine if you go back far enough.
That's absolutely correct to say. Now, I understand you're a native son of the Cannleton, Pennsylvania, Negley, Ohio area. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I first lived in Cannleton until I was about 6 when we moved to Ohio. But my dad and his family are still Darlington residents. As a matter of fact, he started Darlington Days 20 years ago with my uncle. And I'm not that good of a son, apparently, because this is the first one I've been to.
Hey, we'll have Kevin strike that out of the interview later. On page 35, you say Barbara's ghost isn't the only one that sometimes people encounter another more malevolent entity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's the entity with the red eyes. It's been seen by many folks in Cannleton, and this one, when they encounter Barbara, it is not scary. It's a warning usually. But when they encounter this red-eyed whatever, it definitely feels like they're in danger.
Right.
And folks tend to run. It growls, at least from the stories that we were able to collect.
Purported stories that you've collected in this series.
Some speculate that it is the killer, his spirit or her spirit.
Well,
Barbara.
that's interesting too, because that leads into my next question perfectly. In total, you came up with no less than like 4 different theories on page 65 of the book.
Yeah. So if she was murdered in the 1790s, it was right at the height of a war that's largely forgotten now, but It's called the Northwest Indian War, and it was really our first American war. It was, I mean, it started in 1789, right after the Revolution was over.
Some would even say like the French and Indian War was kind of our first world war in a way, because it involved both Europe and what would later become the United States. But
absolutely, but the Northwest Indian War was the United States finally
war.
After we had won the Revolution, just after we won the Revolution. That's when the British had still held many of the forts, including Fort Detroit.
Absolutely,
they refused to give it up after the Revolution, and they were arming the natives and kind of setting off a proxy war. Just to irritate us quite a bit, but
keep picking us off one by one.
That's right. So the natives were incurring across the Ohio River whenever they could, and usually in the summertime. But they would come across, raid farms, and kill folks, and then head back to Ohio where they were protected.
Right.
By the British that were still
kind of, they were the
territory.
safe, kind of like running across the old parallel there. They're not going to be touched. On page 81, chapter 4, I'll go over now to Gretchen's Lock. I don't want to spend too much time on all the stories. I want people to read that book. Pick that book up, folks. That's Legends and Lore of Little Beaver Creek. Michael Kish Booker.
That's right.
There we go. I got it. There we go. Now, there at Gretchen's Lock, tell us, won't you, about the tale of the legend and the theory that deals with, everything. I love the whole thing with swamp fever as well, but go ahead. I want you to tell us.
Gretchen's Lock, allegedly, the chief engineer of the Sandy and Beaver Canal, Mr. Gill, was building the locks there, the system through Sprucevale, which is now part of Little Beaver Creek State Park. And his daughter, unfortunately, passed away from malaria. Well, her mother had passed away on the way over from Europe. He was brought over, according to the tale, to work on this canal system as a chief engineer by the canal company. And she died on the way over on the ship and was buried at sea. Well, when Gretchen was very ill with a fever, and she was hallucinating, and she asked to be buried with her mother. Well, of course, that very much distressed her father. But nonetheless, when she died, he was going to carry out those wishes. He had to finish the lock he was working on, so he entombed her in it.
Wow.
And then finished the system over the next year, and then when he was done, retrieved the body and headed back overseas. Mm-hmm. Along the way, they ran into a storm and the whole ship was lost, so she was buried with her mother. Folks claim that they see her now and again on her lock or around her lock, asking to be buried with her mother or to see her mother again.
It's a very popular haunted area, as people call it.
Yeah.
As people call it.
Very close to Esther Hale's location as well.
Yes, Esther Hale, yes, very. Do you think there's any coincidence between the stories, because Ira Mansfield was so involved in both?
Ira wrote about them all.
Yeah,
so he was definitely a
he has his handprints all over that.
He does. Well, he loved to tell stories around campfires, just like my uncle and my dad did.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, why we have these legends preserved today.
And I think it makes them more interesting, don't you?
I do. Henry Bouquet actually gave smallpox blankets.
That's what I wanted to ask you about now.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, talk about the first element of germ warfare, if you will, folks. This isn't really a stretch. Please elucidate.
Yeah,
Michael, tell us what you've theorized.
A lot of folks know that infected blankets were handed to Native Americans.
Absolutely.
A lot of them don't know what happened here at Fort Pitt. That's where it first started.
And that it dealt with Bouquet at that time. It was Camp 7? Is that it? Camp?
So he handed out the blankets from the infirmary at Fort Pitt to the Delaware Nation that was here closest to the fort. And then they would trade the blankets further into the other nations and devastated. It just decimated the native tribes that had no immunity to this disease. They knew at the time they didn't have the strength to take on the natives, but after the disease ravaged them, and the later end of the Northwest Indian Wars, that's really what I feel turned the tide for the American side.
It was definitely a major factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it started with the British, but then the Americans, of course, reaped the benefits because the disease was already there. Yeah.
Wow. Truly amazing. I mean, when you put all of these pieces together.
Smallpox is a terrible, terrible disease.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Michael, I got to tell you, it is a pleasure, and it has been a pleasure today talking with you. Folks, I encourage you, if you love folklore and legends, do yourself a favor. Go out, pick up a copy. Legends and Lore of Little Beaver Creek, okay? Michael Kish Hooper.